The sun catches the curve of the glass at Apple Park, reflecting a brilliance that feels almost otherworldly. Located in the heart of Cupertino, this $5 billion spaceship campus serves as the architectural manifestation of a $3 trillion empire. It is a monument to perfectionism, where every pane of glass is custom curved and every detail has been obsessed over by the world's most talented engineers. Today, Apple is synonymous with the height of human technological achievement, a cultural juggernaut that shapes how we communicate, work, and perceive reality. It is a company that defines the modern era. Yet, this gleaming circle of success is built upon the ruins of a disaster that nearly erased the company from the pages of history. To understand the gravity of Apple's current dominance, one must travel back to a time when the spaceship was a fever dream, and the company's very existence was measured not in trillions of dollars, but in mere weeks of survival. Imagine the scene in early 1997. The atmosphere in Cupertino was not one of triumph, but of quiet, suffocating desperation. The hallways of the old headquarters were dimly lit, the energy drained from a workforce that had seen too many failures and too many CEOs come and go. The company was bleeding out, losing over $1 billion a year, as its market share plummeted to a dismal 4%. In the world of tech journalism, the word Apple was almost always preceded by the adjective beleaguered. It was the butt of jokes in Silicon Valley, a relic of the 80s that had lost its way in a world dominated by the cold efficiency of Microsoft and the rising tide of generic personal computers. The air in the executive boardrooms was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable fear of men who knew they were presiding over a sinking ship. The situation was far worse than the public realized. Behind closed doors, the financial truth was terrifying. Apple was literally 90 days away from total insolvency. If something radical didn't change, the company would run out of cash to pay its employees and its suppliers. The lights would go out, the doors would be locked, and the icon that had sparked the personal computer revolution would become a cautionary tale in business textbooks. It was a countdown to oblivion, a ticking clock that resonated through every hallway. This wasn't just a business failure. It was the slow, painful death of an American icon. The spirit of innovation that had once defined the Macintosh seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a chaotic mess of confusing products like the Newton and the Performer, gadgets that nobody wanted, and even fewer understood. In those dark months, the boardroom was a place of frantic maneuvering and bitter regrets. Figures like Gil Amelio struggled to plug the leaks in a hull that was already mostly underwater. The ghost of John Scully's decisions still haunted the halls, a reminder of the original sin, the day Steve Jobs was cast out of the company he had helped create in a garage. Without its soul, Apple had become a faceless corporation trying to fight Bill Gates and his Microsoft juggernaut at its own game, and it was losing spectacularly. The vision was gone, replaced by spreadsheets that didn't add up, and a product line that felt more like a clearance aisle than a pioneer of the future. The design department was tucked away, with young talents like Joni Ive yet to find their true voice in a sea of beige boxes and corporate mediocrity. How does a company go from this state of dead on arrival to becoming the most valuable entity on Earth? How do you stop a 90-day countdown to bankruptcy and turn it into a multi-generational legacy? The answer lies in a series of ruthless decisions, unlikely alliances, and the return of a man who had been written off by the world. We are about to dive into the most incredible comeback in the history of global business, revealing the dark moments and the flashes of genius that saved the Mac. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The journey from the edge of the abyss began with a desperate phone call and a gamble that would change the world forever. The contrast between the dark, empty boardroom of 1997 and the bright, glass-walled future of today is a story of survival against all odds. The root of Apple's decay was planted long before the 1997 bankruptcy crisis. It traced back to 1985, a year that many historians call the company's original sin. On a rainy afternoon in Cupertino, the board of directors made a choice that would haunt the tech world for a decade. They chose the professional manager over the visionary. They chose John Sculley, the man brought in from Pepsi, over Steve Jobs. By firing Jobs, Apple didn't just lose its co-founder, it lost its soul and its appetite for the impossible. Without Jobs' abrasive perfectionism to steer the ship, the company began to drift into a dangerous sea of corporate mediocrity. The focus shifted from changing the world to meeting quarterly projections. For a while, the momentum of the Macintosh carried them forward, but momentum is a finite resource. By the 90s, the engine was beginning to sputter. The era that followed was defined by a dizzying and destructive product bloat. In 1994, computer stores presented a wall of confusion. There were dozens of different Macintosh models, but none had a clear reason to exist. You had the Performer, the Quadra, the Centris, and the LC series. Each had sub-models with names that sounded more like car parts than revolutionary technology. Customers were baffled, and salespeople couldn't explain why one machine cost $500 more than its neighbor. It was a strategy of throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. Amidst this chaos was the Newton, a handheld assistant that was supposed to be the next big thing. Instead, it became a symbol of Apple's hubris, an expensive, buggy device that struggled to recognize handwriting and was ruthlessly mocked by the public. The financial toll was devastating. As the product line expanded into a bloated mess, the profit margins contracted. Apple was spending hundreds of millions on research and development for projects that led nowhere. By the mid-90s, the company was hemorrhaging cash, reporting annual losses that exceeded $1 billion. The stock price, once a source of pride, crashed to all-time lows, making the company a prime target for a fire sale. Investors were fleeing, and the board of directors seemed paralyzed, trapped in a cycle of panic and poor decision-making. They were desperate for a savior, leading to a revolving door of leadership that only deepened the crisis. First came John Sculley, who tried to turn Apple into a consumer electronics giant, but lacked the technical intuition to see where the industry was heading. Then came Michael Spindler, nicknamed the Diesel for his relentless work ethic, but he found himself crushed by a dying business model. Finally, there was Gil Amelio, a man who arrived with a reputation for corporate turnarounds, but found himself presiding over a house of cards. These leaders were spreadsheet men in a world that needed dreamers. They focused on cost-cutting, trying to make Apple more like Microsoft. In the design labs, young talents like Joni Ive were buried under corporate bureaucracy, their visionary ideas ignored in favor of generic beige boxes. It was a fatal mistake. By trying to beat Bill Gates at the game of commodity computing, Apple abandoned its unique identity as the high-design alternative for the creative. They were fighting a losing battle against the Windows juggernaut, which was already installed on most of the world's computers. The identity crisis was mirrored in the software. Apple's operating system, System 7, was once the envy of the industry, but it was rapidly becoming obsolete. It was prone to crashes, lacked modern multitasking, and was built on an aging foundation that couldn't support the internet age. The project meant to replace it, codenamed Copland, had become a bloated nightmare. A software graveyard where years of work and millions of dollars disappeared without producing a single product. In late 1996, the realization finally hit home. Apple had no operating system for the future, no vision for the present, and no money left to fix either. The ghosts of the last 12 years had finally caught up to them. The company was a hollow shell, waiting for the final blow that would send it into history as just another failed experiment in the Silicon Valley sun. Gil Amelio was a man standing on a burning platform, looking for a way out. By late 1996, the failure of the operating system project left Apple with no digital brain. In a move of desperation, Emilio began shopping for a new operating system to save the Macintosh. While many advisors pointed toward BOS, a flashy newcomer, Emilio pivoted toward a ghost from Apple's past. He authorized a $400 million gamble to acquire Next, the workstation company Steve Jobs built after his exile. It was a deal made out of technical necessity intended to secure the Next Step software, but it carried a hidden passenger. When the papers were finally signed, Steve Jobs walked back through the doors of the company he had co-founded, not as a king, but as an advisor. The return of the outcast was complete. The halls of Cupertino felt the shift immediately. Jobs did not act like a man providing casual advice. He moved through the campus with the grace of a founder who saw his house in disarray. He spent his first weeks wandering the corridors, asking uncomfortable questions and observing the rot of bureaucracy. He discovered young designers like Johnny Ive, tucked away in a basement studio, surrounded by models of things that would never be built, their creativity stifled by management layers. He saw thousands of engineers working on projects that served no purpose other than to justify their own budgets. While Emilio tried to manage the optics of the transition, Jobs was quietly assessing who was playing to win and who was simply playing for a paycheck. The atmosphere was a mixture of hope and terror. By July 1997, the board of directors had seen enough of the decline. The stock price was still cratering towards zero, and Emilio's leadership had failed to stop the hemorrhaging of talent and cash. He was ousted in a swift boardroom coup, leaving a power vacuum that only one person could fill. Jobs accepted the role of interim CEO, coining the title ICEO. It was a temporary position that would become the greatest transformation in history. He didn't want the crown for the sake of the title. He wanted the authority to perform surgery on the patient. The era of ruthless focus had begun. Jobs knew that survival required more than just hard work. It required a total psychological shift for every person left in the building. A legendary moment occurred after Jobs took the helm. He gathered the executives in a room with a whiteboard. For years, Apple had been trying to please every possible niche, resulting in a chaotic mess of product lines. Jobs walked to the board and drew a simple 2x2 grid. Across the top, he wrote the words consumer and pro. Down the side, he wrote desktop and portable. He told the room that this was the new Apple. They would make 4 great products, one for each square, and cancel everything else. The room went silent. It was an execution order for hundreds of jobs. It was a moment of terrifying clarity that stripped away the clutter and left only the core purpose of the company. The great cull was brutal. Jobs looked at the 350 projects Apple was currently developing and ordered 70% of them to be cancelled overnight. The Newton was one of the first to go. He shut down the divisions making printers, scanners, and peripherals. He wanted Apple to do a few things perfectly rather than 100 things mediocrely. To Jobs, focus didn't mean saying yes to the thing you were building. It meant saying no to the 100 other good ideas that were in the way. He was clearing the brush to make room for a new forest. This was the philosophy of subtraction, a radical belief that by doing less, the company could finally achieve much more. This subtraction came with a human cost. Thousands of employees were laid off, and the campus was filled with the reality of a company shrinking to survive. The hallways were no longer filled with the chatter of committees. They were filled with the focused silence of a skeleton crew. Critics mocked the move, claiming that a company could not shrink its way to greatness. But Jobs wasn't just cutting costs. He was restoring the company's identity. He was making room for the insanely great products hidden in the minds of his designers. The chaos was being replaced by a burning vision that would soon shock the world. The stage was set for a recovery that no one thought possible. But first, Apple had to make a deal with its oldest and most hated enemy, The atmosphere at the 1997 Mac World Expo in Boston was heavy with the scent of uncertainty. For the thousands of Apple loyalists gathered in the auditorium, this was not just a tech conference. It was a vigil for a dying friend. When Steve Jobs walked onto the stage, dressed in his signature black turtleneck and jeans, the applause was thunderous, but it carried a frantic edge. People were looking for a savior, yet nobody was prepared for the revelation that was about to shake the foundations of the industry. Jobs began to speak about the need for partnerships, and as a giant screen behind him flickered to life, the collective heart of the Mac faithful skipped a beat. A massive, towering image of Bill Gates appeared via satellite from Seattle, his face looming over the audience. The reaction was instantaneous. A wave of boos and hisses rippled through the hall, a visceral rejection of the man who had spent the last decade systematically dismantling Apple's market share. To the crowd, Gates was the enemy, the personification of the beige, corporate monotony they had spent their lives resisting. Seeing him loom over Jobs like a digital big brother was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. But Jobs stood his ground, his voice calm and resolute over the din of the protest. He explained that if Apple was to survive, it had to stop the US versus them mentality. He argued that for Apple to win, Microsoft did not necessarily have to lose. It was a cold, hard truth that many found impossible to swallow, yet it was the only way forward. Behind the scenes, this was a calculated deal with the devil. Microsoft agreed to invest $150 million in Apple, a critical infusion of cash that gave the company vital breathing room. More importantly, Gates committed to developing Microsoft Office for the Mac for at least 5 years and making Internet Explorer the default browser. In exchange, Apple dropped its long-standing lawsuits against Microsoft regarding user interface copyrights. It was a strategic surrender that bought Apple time, the one commodity Jobs needed more than anything else. This partnership stabilized the stock price almost overnight, signaling to the world that Apple was no longer a sinking ship, but a company with powerful allies. With the financial floor stabilized, Jobs turned his attention to the brand's damaged psyche. He knew that Apple could not just sell machines, it had to sell a philosophy. This led to the birth of the Think Different campaign, one of the most iconic marketing moves in history. Instead of showing circuit boards or megahertz speeds, the advertisements featured grainy, black-and-white footage of history's greatest rebels, geniuses, and troublemakers. From Albert Einstein to Mahatma Gandhi, these were people who did not fit in, who challenged the status quo. The message was clear. Apple was the brand for the misfits. It shifted the conversation away from technical specifications and toward human values. It told the world that the Mac was not just a tool. It was a badge of identity for those who saw the world differently. While the world was captivated by the billboards, a radical transformation was occurring inside the design labs of Cupertino. Jobs had found a kindred spirit in a young British designer named Joni Ive. Together, they began to formalize the philosophy of no. This was not just about cutting projects. It was about a relentless pursuit of simplicity in industrial design. Jobs and Ive shared a disdain for the industry standard, the ugly, beige plastic boxes that littered offices around the globe. They viewed these machines as soulless commodities. Jobs wanted to create something that was not just functional, but beautiful, an object of desire that people would want to touch. They began a series of secret experiments, exploring materials and colors that had never been used in computing. The goal was to strip away the unnecessary, to find the essence of the machine. This meant removing the clutter of ports, the clunky external drives, and the confusing buttons that had defined the PC era. Every no they uttered was a step toward a singular yes that would redefine the company's aesthetic. The tension within the design team was high. They were working against the clock and against the skepticism of an industry that believed computers should be boring. The public was still reeling from the Microsoft partnership, wondering if Apple had lost its soul. Little did they know that in the shadows of the lab, a translucent, blue revolution was being born, a machine that would prove Apple's best days were not behind it, but were just beginning to glow. The question remained, would the world embrace a company that had shaken hands with its enemy to pave a path toward a translucent future? The silence in the design lab was broken by the sound of a plastic shell clicking into place. Steve Jobs stood over a table, his eyes fixed on a shape that defied every convention of the computing world. Beside him, Johnny Ive waited, his quiet confidence anchoring the room. What sat before them was the iMac G3, a machine draped in a translucent Bondi blue casing that looked more like candy than a workstation. It was the physical manifestation of the Think Different campaign, a bold declaration that the era of the beige box was over. For years, the industry had treated the computer as a utilitarian tool, a cold gray slab meant to be hidden. Jobs and Ive wanted it to be the centerpiece of the home. They wanted people to fall in love with its glowing, friendly curves. The iMac was a gamble of massive proportions. It was not just the color that was radical, it was what Jobs decided to leave out. In a move that sent shockwaves through the tech community, Apple stripped away the floppy disk drive. To the pundits of 1998, this was madness. The floppy was the universal standard for moving data, and removing it felt like selling a car without a steering wheel. But Jobs was looking at a horizon others could not see. He believed the future was the internet, and he was willing to drag his customers into that future. This was the philosophy of no in its most aggressive form. By saying no to legacy tech, he was saying yes to the modern web. The iMac became the fastest-selling computer in Apple's history, and for the first time in a decade, the company's bank accounts began to swell with profit rather than drain with debt. However, the iMac was only the beginning of a larger shift. As the new millennium dawned, Jobs articulated his digital hub strategy. He realized the computer was no longer just for spreadsheets. It was the command center for a new digital lifestyle. People were buying digital cameras and primitive MP3 players, but had no way to manage the chaos of files. Jobs saw the Mac as the sun at the center of this digital solar system. This vision birthed a suite of software: iMovie, iPhoto, and most pivotally, iTunes. The music industry was then in a state of carnage. Piracy was rampant, and record executives were paralyzed by fear. Jobs saw a vacuum and moved with speed. He did not just build a software player. He built a bridge between hardware and content. In October 2001, Jobs stood on a small stage and pulled a white device from his pocket. It was the iPod. With its scroll wheel and promise of 1,000 songs in your pocket, it was a masterpiece of Jony Ive's minimalist aesthetic. It was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. But the genius of the iPod was not just hardware, it was the ecosystem. When the iTunes Store launched in 2003, it changed how people consumed media. For 99 cents, users could buy music legally and easily. This was the birth of the walled garden, a seamless integration of hardware and software that made it nearly impossible for competitors to break in. If you owned an iPod, you used iTunes. If you used iTunes, you bought from Apple. The experience was so frictionless that users did not feel trapped. They felt liberated from the complexity of traditional tech. By the mid-2000s, Apple was no longer a company on the brink. It was a cultural juggernaut. The internal culture had been forged in the 1997 crisis, creating a team that was lean and obsessively focused. Jobs had transitioned the company from a niche maker into a lifestyle powerhouse. Yet, he knew the greatest threat to the iPod was the mobile phone. If a phone could play music, the iPod would die. Rather than wait for a competitor to kill his most successful product, Jobs decided to do it himself. The project was shrouded in secrecy, known as Project Purple. It was a multi-year struggle to shrink the power of a Mac into a palm. In 2007, the culmination of the strategy that began in that 1997 boardroom was finally ready. Jobs took the stage and announced 3 revolutionary products: a touch iPod, a mobile phone, and an internet communicator. Then, with a smirk, he revealed they were not 3 devices. They were one. The iPhone had arrived. It was the ultimate victory of design and focus over the chaos of the past, signaling a future where Apple would not just survive, but rule. The triumph of the iPhone was not merely a victory of engineering, but a validation of a philosophy that had been brewing since Steve Jobs first reclaimed his seat in 1997. To understand how Apple transformed from a dying relic into a global titan, one must look past the sleek glass and aluminum to the brutalist logic of radical subtraction. This was the anatomy of focus, a discipline so intense it bordered on the religious. While other tech giants of the era, notably Sony, were flooding the market with thousands of distinct product variations, Apple took the opposite path. Sony, once the undisputed king of consumer electronics, had become a sprawling, fractured empire. They had dozens of models of Walkmans, hundreds of television sets, and a dizzying array of cameras, each competing with the other for resources and attention. Steve Jobs looked at that model and saw a slow-motion suicide. He understood that when you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing well. For Jobs, focus was not about sitting in a room and deciding what to build. He famously argued that focus meant saying no to the 100 other good ideas that were there. It was a psychological gauntlet. Imagine being a brilliant engineer who had spent 3 years developing a revolutionary new peripheral, only to have the CEO kill the project in 5 minutes because it didn't fit the vision. This was the reality inside Cupertino. The philosophy of no wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a weapon used to clear the path for greatness. Jobs believed that the human mind has a limited capacity for excellence, and that capacity should never be diluted by pretty good products. Every time Apple refused to add a feature, like a physical keyboard on a phone or an expansion slot on a laptop, it was an act of preservation. They were protecting the clarity of the user experience. This clarity became Apple's greatest weapon in the war for the digital future. While Microsoft and its hardware partners were obsessed with market share, chasing every possible demographic with a different version of the PC, Apple stopped playing that game entirely. They realized that trying to beat Windows at being Windows was a fool's errand. Instead, they focused on being Apple. This meant prioritizing identity over reach. They weren't building tools for everyone. They were building instruments for the crazy ones, the creators and dreamers. By narrowing the target, they hit a much larger audience. People didn't buy an iMac or an iPhone because it had the most RAM or the fastest processor. They bought it because it was simple. The simplicity mandate was a relentless pursuit of the intuitive. If a user had to read a manual, the design team had failed. This led to the removal of ports, the elimination of buttons, and the stripping away of visual clutter until only the essence of the device remained. The leadership style required to maintain this level of focus was nothing short of cinematic. Jobs didn't just manage, he directed. He viewed the company as a grand narrative, where every product launch was a climax and every design detail was a character arc. He was known for his reality distortion field, a mix of charisma and unshakable belief that could convince engineers to achieve the impossible. His meetings were high-stakes dramas. Every year, he would take the top 100 employees to a secret retreat. They would brainstorm the top 10 things Apple should do next. Once the list was finalized, Jobs would take a thick marker, cross out the bottom 7, and announce that they were only doing the top 3. It was a ruthless pruning that ensured the company's lifeblood flowed only to the most vital branches. This radical subtraction was the antithesis of the corporate world's obsession with expansion. In most boardrooms, growth is measured by the breadth of the catalog. Jobs proved that true power comes from the depth of the impact. By the late 2000s, this mindset had become the DNA of the company. It allowed them to move with a precision that their larger competitors could not match. Success was the ultimate result of a long series of subtractions. They had found their soul by cutting away the unnecessary. The magnitude of Apple's ascent can be captured in a single staggering figure: $3 trillion. It is a number so vast that it almost loses its meaning, transcending the realm of business to enter the territory of modern myth. This valuation is not merely a reflection of stock prices or quarterly earnings. It is the ultimate monument to a resurrection that was never supposed to happen. When we look at the shimmering, curved glass of Apple Park today, it is difficult to reconcile this titan with the shivering, fractured entity that was gasping for air in the late 90s. Every leaf on the trees of that $5 billion campus was watered by the sweat of a team that once lived on a 90-day countdown to extinction. To truly appreciate the weight of this comeback, one must imagine the silent world where Apple died in 1997. It is a haunting counterfactual. Without the return of Steve Jobs and the subsequent birth of the iPhone, the digital landscape of the 21st century would be unrecognizable. We might still be navigating clunky, stylus-driven interfaces or carrying around separate devices for every task. The aesthetic revolution, the idea that a tool should also be a piece of art, might have been delayed by a generation. The App Store, an engine that fueled a whole new economy and birthed thousands of businesses, would simply not exist. Apple didn't just save itself, it dictated the tempo and the texture of modern life. The transformation was profound. Apple evolved from a niche computer manufacturer into a global cultural movement. It became the brand of the rebel, then the brand of the professional, and finally, the brand of the world. This wasn't achieved through marketing tricks, but through a fundamental shift in how a corporation relates to its users. They stopped selling megahertz and started selling emotion. They realized that in an increasingly complex world, the ultimate luxury is simplicity. This realization turned customers into devotees and products into icons. It was a triumph of identity over market share, a lesson in how a company can lead by refusing to follow. The contrast between the two eras is visceral. Picture the 1997 boardroom once more. The air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and the crushing weight of inevitable failure. Executives in ill-fitting suits argued over spreadsheets, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of dying CRT monitors. Now, compare that to the electric silence of a modern iPhone launch at the Steve Jobs Theater. Thousands of people hold their breath as a single piece of glass is unveiled. A device that contains more computing power than the machines that sent men to the moon. This is the difference between surviving a crisis and defining an era. The journey from that dark room to this bright stage was paved with the no's that everyone else was too afraid to say. Steve Jobs often said that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who actually do. In 1997, he was the craziest man in Silicon Valley. He bet the remains of his legacy on a vision of minimalism that the market insisted was a mistake. He bet on Bill Gates, his greatest rival, to buy enough time to prove his point. He bet on Jony Ive's artistic sensibilities over the industry's obsession with utility, and he won. The legacy of Apple's comeback is a testament to the power of human will and the clarity of purpose. It reminds us that no matter how close you are to the edge, a radical return to your core values can lead to a height of success you never dared to dream of. As the story of this great comeback concludes, it leaves us with a final, piercing question. Apple's success was built on the items it threw away, the projects it killed, and the distractions it ignored. It was a masterpiece of subtraction. In our own lives, we are often overwhelmed by the noise of constant addition, trying to do everything and please everyone. But greatness requires a different path. It requires the courage to prune the branches so the tree can grow. What are the specific things in your life you need to say no to today?